February 24, 1945. Pforzheim, Germany. Flight Lieutenant James Thompson adjusted his oxygen mask as Lancaster ED-763 climbed through 18,000 feet into the darkness above England. Around him, 367 other Lancaster bombers formed up in the night sky, their black silhouettes invisible against the starless void. The target folder on his navigator's table showed a city of 79,000 people that most of his crew had never heard of. Pforzheim, a jewelry manufacturing center in southwestern Germany. Strategic value, minimal. Civilian population density, extreme. 8 hours later, approximately 17,600 people would be dead. The city center would cease to exist, and Thompson would never speak publicly about this mission for the rest of his life. That same month, 200 miles to the east, Captain Robert Morgan climbed into his B-17 Flying Fortress at 600 hours for a daylight mission to Berlin. Unlike Thompson's Lancaster, Morgan's bomber bristled with 50 caliber machine guns. Unlike Thompson's crew, Morgan's gunners could see their attackers coming. Unlike Thompson's mission, Morgan's target was the Erkner ball-bearing factory, a legitimate industrial target that, if destroyed, would impact German tank production for months. Morgan's formation would fly in broad daylight. They would face coordinated flak batteries and fighter attacks. They would lose bombers to visible, terrifying enemy action. But they would aim at factories, not city centers. They would drop bombs they could see fall. They would know exactly what they hit. 2 allied nations. 2 bomber forces. 2 completely opposite answers to the same question. How do you destroy an enemy's ability to make war? The British chose darkness, saturation, and total war. The Americans chose daylight, precision, and industrial targeting. The difference would cost over 100,000 airmen their lives and forever shape how nations think about strategic bombing. This is the story of how those choices were made, what they cost, and whether either approach actually worked. The divergence began not with doctrine but with desperation. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted from attacking RAF airfields to bombing London. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers struck the British capital. By May 1941, over 43,000 British civilians had died in what became known as the Blitz. The bombing was indiscriminate. The suffering was total. The message was clear. Modern warfare had erased the distinction between soldier and civilian. RAF Bomber Command had already been conducting raids against German targets, but with devastating inefficiency. Early war bombers like the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley and the Vickers Wellington lacked the range, payload, and defensive armament to survive daylight operations. Losses in daylight raids exceeded 50% in some missions, rates that would destroy any air force within months. The solution was obvious: bomb at night. But an August 1941 report by David Bensusan Butt, a civil servant analyzing bomber effectiveness, revealed a devastating truth. Of bombers recorded as attacking their targets, only 1 in 3 dropped bombs within 5 miles of the aiming point. Over the Ruhr industrial region, with its heavy flak and searchlight defenses, the figure dropped to 1 in 10, 5 miles. In darkness, with primitive navigation equipment, heavy cloud cover, German night fighters, and intensive flak, RAF bombers literally could not hit what they were aiming at. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, appointed to lead Bomber Command in February 1942, drew the logical conclusion from this data. If you cannot hit specific factories, hit entire cities. If you cannot destroy individual plants, destroy the workers' housing, the transportation networks, the electrical grids, the water systems, everything that makes industrial production possible. Harris called it area bombing. His critics called it something else entirely. The American approach developed from completely different circumstances. The United States entered the war with no cities bombed, no civilians killed by enemy action, and no emotional imperative for revenge. American air power theorists, particularly at the Air Corps Tactical School, had spent the 1930s developing doctrine based on the assumption that strategic bombing could win wars by destroying an enemy's industrial capacity. The theory was elegant. Identify critical industries, ball bearings, oil refineries, aircraft factories, destroy those industries with precision strikes. Watch enemy war production collapse without needing to invade or bomb civilians. This doctrine required several things Britain didn't have: bombers that could defend themselves in daylight, bomb sites accurate enough for precision targeting, and enough aircraft to sustain inevitable losses while maintaining pressure. The Americans believed they had all three. The B-17 Flying Fortress, entering service in 1938, featured defensive armament unprecedented in bomber design, up to 1350 caliber machine guns covering every approach angle. Flying in tight formation, B-17 groups could create overlapping fields of fire that theoretically would destroy any attacking fighter. The formations themselves became known as combat boxes, geometric arrangements designed to maximize defensive firepower. The Norden bomb sight, developed through the 1930s at enormous cost, used analog computing to calculate the precise moment to release bombs for maximum accuracy. In perfect conditions, the Norden could theoretically place bombs in a 100-foot circle from 20,000 feet. The device was so secret that bombardiers were trained to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. When American bombers arrived in England in 1942, the stage was set for one of the great experiments in military history. Could two completely different approaches to strategic bombing coexist, cooperate, and ultimately achieve victory? The first major American mission came on August 17, 1942. 12 B-17s bombed the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. All aircraft returned safely. Bombs hit the target area. American commanders declared the mission a success and proof that daylight precision bombing was viable. The British were unconvinced. Air Marshal Harris had watched too many of his own bombers burn in daylight to believe that better guns and tighter formations would solve the fundamental problem. Daylight made you visible, and visibility was death, but Harris had his own proving ground ready. On May 30, 1942, Bomber Command launched Operation Millennium, the first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne. The actual number was 1,047 aircraft, assembled by stripping training units and using every operational bomber available. The raid lasted 90 minutes. Bombers attacked in a continuous stream, overwhelming German defenses through sheer numbers. Pathfinder aircraft dropped incendiaries to mark the target area. Following waves dropped high explosives to shatter water mains and bury streets under rubble. Final waves dropped more incendiaries that, with fires already burning and water mains broken, created an unstoppable conflagration. Cologne's medieval center burned for days. 469 people died. Remarkably few given the scale of destruction, but 45,000 people lost their homes. Industrial production in Cologne dropped by half for months afterward. The raid proved that concentrated area bombing could achieve strategic effects. It also established the pattern that would define Bomber Command operations for the rest of the war. Pathfinders, incendiaries, high explosives, then more incendiaries. The goal wasn't just to damage. It was to create firestorms that emergency services couldn't control. The American 8th Air Force, meanwhile, was learning painful lessons about daylight operations. As missions penetrated deeper into Germany, losses increased. The B-17s could defend themselves against single attackers, but German fighters developed new tactics. Head-on attacks at closing speeds of 500 mm that gave gunners less than 2 seconds to react, and standing-off attacks using rockets that outranged defensive machine guns. The mission that broke American confidence came on. August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the successful Rouen raid, 376 B-17s launched against 2 targets, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. These were perfect precision bombing targets, critical industries whose destruction would cascade through Germany's entire war production. The Regensburg force would fly on to North Africa after bombing, a novel tactic designed to confuse German defenses. The Schweinfurt force would return to England after their attack. German fighters intercepted both formations with unprecedented ferocity. Without fighter escort, P-47 Thunderbolts lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. The B-17s fought alone. The head-on attacks that Americans feared became devastating reality. Damaged bombers fell out of formation, immediately becoming easy targets for German fighters that picked them off methodically. B-17s were shot down. 552 airmen died, Hundreds more were wounded or captured. The bombers that returned showed battle damage that shocked ground crews. Fuselages punctured by hundreds of holes, tail sections nearly severed. Dead gunners still at their positions. The 8th Air Force had lost 16% of the attacking force in a single day. But worse was coming. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt. This time, 291 B-17s attacked. 60 were shot down, a loss rate of 20.6%. Another 138 returned with heavy damage. Of 2,900 men who flew the mission, over 650 were casualties. The second Schweinfurt raid broke the back of unescorted daylight bombing. Deep penetration missions were suspended. American strategy appeared to have failed completely. The British seemed vindicated. Daylight bombing against a prepared, determined enemy was simply impossible. The turning point. What saved American daylight bombing wasn't doctrine or formations or better bombers. It was a single aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. Developed initially for the RAF, the Mustang became transformative when American engineers married its airframe to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was a fighter with performance matching or exceeding German fighters, but with range that changed everything. With drop tanks, P-51s could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, over 1,000 miles. For the first time, American bombers wouldn't fight alone. German fighters that had previously attacked with impunity would themselves face attack from escorts with superior performance. The impact was immediate and devastating to the Luftwaffe. In Big Week, February 20-25, 1944, American bombers with full P-51 escorts struck German aircraft factories. 226 German fighters were destroyed in the air. Hundreds more were damaged or lost to crashes. The Luftwaffe began losing experienced pilots faster than training units could replace them. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, American fighters had achieved air superiority over Western Europe. German fighters rarely challenged bomber formations in strength. When they did, they were slaughtered by roving P-51s that hunted them from altitude. Daylight precision bombing became feasible again, not because the doctrine had been right all along, but because the introduction of long-range escort fighters had fundamentally changed the tactical equation. The British response: maximum effort. While Americans were solving their fighter escort problem, the RAF was perfecting area bombing into an industrial science. Air Marshal Harris had assembled the tools he needed. 4-engine Lancaster bombers with 14,000-pound bomb capacity, sophisticated navigation systems like H-2S ground mapping radar, and Pathfinder squadrons skilled at marking targets in any weather. The Lancaster bomber, entering service in 1942, was in many ways the opposite of the B-17. Where the fortress bristled with defensive guns, the Lancaster carried minimal armament. Its defense was darkness and speed. Where the B-17 carried a 4,000-pound bomb load, the Lancaster could carry 14,000 pounds, or with modifications, single bombs weighing 22,000 pounds. The Lancaster could reach targets the B-17 struggled with, carry bombs the B-17 couldn't lift, and operate in weather that grounded American formations. In the hands of Bomber Command, it became the most effective strategic bomber of the European war, measured by tons of ordnance delivered. Harris used these capabilities to create firestorms. The technique was refined scientifically. First, Pathfinders marked the target with colored flares. Initial waves dropped 4,000-pound cookies, high-capacity bombs that shattered buildings and exposed wooden structures. Following waves dropped incendiaries by the tens of thousands. The combination of exposed timber, broken gas lines, and massed incendiaries created fires that merged into firestorms, self-sustaining infernos where superheated air rose so rapidly that hurricane-force winds were created at ground level, sucking oxygen and people into the flames. The destruction was total, predictable, and horrifying. Hamburg, July 1943. Operation Gomorrah created a firestorm that killed approximately 37,000 people in a single night. Temperatures in the city center exceeded 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. People in bomb shelters died from carbon monoxide poisoning or were cremated when shelters became ovens. Those who fled into streets were sucked into the firestorm or suffocated when superheated air seared their lungs. Dresden, February 1945. The city, swollen with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, was struck by massive RAF and USAF raids that created another firestorm. Death toll estimates range from 25,000 to 40,000. The destruction was so complete that exact figures remain impossible to determine. Pforzheim, February 1945. The raid that Flight Lieutenant Thompson participated in killed 7,600 people, approximately 22% of the city's population, in 22 minutes. It remains the highest casualty rate relative to population of any bombing raid in the European theater. Harris never apologized for these operations. His position was consistent. Germany had started the bombing of cities with the Blitz. Britain was simply finishing it with greater efficiency. The workers dying in their homes were the same workers producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Their deaths were strategically valid, morally justified retaliation, and necessary to shorten the war. By war's end, the statistics were staggering. RAF bomber. Command, 955,044 tons of bombs dropped on European targets. 306,414 operational sorties flown. 55,573 aircrew killed in action. 8,403 aircraft lost in operations. Loss rate 2.3% per sortie. Higher in 1943, in 44, lower in 1945, US. 8th Air Force, 692,918 tons of bombs. Dropped 291,508 operational sorties. 26,000. Aircrew killed in action, 6,537 bombers lost. Loss rate 2.2% per sortie. Peaked at over 5% in late 1943. The human cost was enormous on both sides. Bomber command casualties exceeded the losses of any British ground formation except the Army in World War I. American bomber losses exceeded Marine Corps casualties in the Pacific. The life expectancy of a bomber crewman in 1943 was measured in missions, not years. But did it work? The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, examined thousands of German factories, interviewed hundreds of officials, and analyzed production records. Its conclusions were complex and controversial. Oil campaign. American precision attacks on synthetic oil plants were devastatingly effective. German oil production dropped from 316,000 tons in March 1944 to 107,000 tons by September 1944. Panzer divisions sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Luftwaffe pilot training was curtailed. This campaign alone may have shortened the war by months. Transportation. Combined RAF and USAAF attacks on German rail networks, marshalling yards and bridges systematically destroyed Germany's ability to move war materials. By early 1945, the German economy was fragmenting into isolated pockets that couldn't support each other. Ball bearings, the Schweinfurt raids that cost so dearly, had minimal lasting impact. German production dispersed, imports increased from Switzerland and Sweden, and stockpiles proved adequate. The raids were tactical disasters that achieved little strategic effect. Area bombing. The survey was damning. The city attacks caused great suffering and loss of life, but their effect on production was disappointing. German war production actually increased through 1944, despite massive bombing. Workers made homeless were relocated. Factories were dispersed. Morale remained adequate for production to continue. The survey concluded that precision attacks on oil and transportation were war-winning. Area attacks on cities were not, but this analysis, completed in the moral clarity of victory, missed crucial context that veterans understood. In 1942 to 43, when Britain stood alone, area bombing was the only way RAF bombers could strike Germany at all. In those desperate years, the morale effect, showing Germans they weren't safe, showing Soviets that Britain was fighting, showing occupied nations that resistance continued, may have been worth more than any tonnage of destroyed factories. The moral reckoning, the bomber offensive, raised questions that remain unresolved. Captain Robert Morgan, who survived 25 missions in his B-17 Memphis Belle, defended precision bombing until his death. We aimed at factories. We hit factories. The Germans put those factories in cities. That's on them, not us. We did everything possible to avoid civilian casualties while still destroying their ability to make war. But the reality was more complex. The Norden bomb site's vaunted accuracy worked only in perfect conditions. Clear weather, no flak, no evasive maneuvers, no equipment malfunction. In operational conditions, American precision bombing often scattered bombs across entire urban areas. Raids on ball-bearing plants killed thousands of nearby civilians. The firebombing of Dresden included American bombers dropping ordnance through clouds. Guided only by fires already burning, Flight Lieutenant Thompson never spoke About Pforzheim, but his navigator, Sergeant William Hayes, did in a 1990 interview. We knew it was a city. We knew there were civilians. But we'd seen what Germany did to London, to Coventry, to British cities. I can't say we felt good about it. I can say we felt it was necessary. Whether I was right to feel that way, I still don't know. Air Marshal Harris faced the strongest criticism. His single-minded focus on area bombing continued even after long-range fighters made precision bombing viable. His insistence that Germany could be bombed into surrender proved wrong. His unwillingness to divert resources to support D-Day preparations created friction with American commanders. Yet Harris had prosecuted the only offensive Britain could mount when invasion was impossible. His bombers kept pressure on Germany through years when Britain had few other options. And his crews paid a terrible price doing what their nation asked. The Americans claimed moral superiority through precision targeting, but their adoption of area bombing tactics in Japan, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo that killed 100,000 in a single night, suggested that doctrine was always contingent on circumstances. Legacy. The lessons we still haven't learned. Bomber offensive established patterns that echo through every subsequent conflict. Technology versus tactics. The Americans were right that precision was possible, but only after technological solutions, long-range escorts, solved tactical problems, fighter interception. Doctrine without adequate technology is just theory, industrial war. Both approaches worked eventually because Allied industrial capacity overwhelmed Axis production. German factories destroyed by bombing were rebuilt or dispersed until bomber production exceeded German capacity to respond. The lesson wasn't about bombing technique, but economic power, civilian immunity. The bomber offensive shattered forever the distinction between combatant and civilian. Every subsequent war has struggled with this legacy. Precision weapons haven't solved the problem, they've just made it more politically manageable. Moral complexity. Neither side was purely right or wrong. The British faced existential threat and responded with total war. The Americans pursued precision that often proved illusory. Both killed enormous numbers of civilians while claiming strategic necessity. In 1945, the bombers came home. Lancasters that had burned cities were scrapped by the thousands. B-17s that had fought across Germany were sold for scrap metal. The airmen went home, many never speaking about what they'd done, what they'd seen, what they still dreamed about in darkness. The debate about who was right, the British with their area bombing or the Americans with their precision doctrine, misses the deeper truth. Strategic bombing worked because it was part of a combined arms campaign that included armies, navies, strategic deception, economic warfare, and Soviet pressure that diverted most German forces to the Eastern Front. Bombing alone never forces industrial nations to surrender. But bombing combined with imminent military defeat, economic collapse, and political isolation can shorten wars and save lives, at the cost of other lives, a calculus that remains morally troubling 80 years later. Flight Lieutenant Thompson's Lancaster and Captain Morgan's Flying Fortress represented two answers to an impossible question. How do you destroy an enemy without destroying yourself? The British answer: accept the darkness, accept the moral burden, and burn the enemy's capacity to make war. The American answer: fight in daylight, aim precisely, and convince yourself that industrial targets justify civilian deaths. Neither answer was entirely right. Neither was entirely wrong. Both cost more than their advocates expected, and the questions they raised about the limits of warfare, the value of civilian life, and the moral costs of victory remain as urgent today as they were in the darkest nights over Germany. When young men in both British and American bombers dropped their ordnance and turned for home, hoping they'd done the right thing, knowing they'd never be completely sure.